Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me today to introduce our speaker, Mr. John Seager. John is President and CEO of Population Connection. Population Connection, in my view, is one of the leading NGOs in this country that deals with population issues, primarily through education in a variety of ways, including delivering lectures such as John is going to give us today. He travels throughout the U.S., visiting universities everywhere, giving this talk. They also produce some really excellent education materials for schools, for public schools, and really, really valuable stuff. John is trained in political science from Trinity College in Connecticut. Amongst his experiences is some time with the EPA under the Clinton administration. And he also served as the Chief of Staff for Representative Kostmayer from Pennsylvania. And, he was a senior member of, the representative was senior member of House Foreign Affairs and Interior Committees. So John has a wide variety of experience. And he publishes quite a number of articles as well on these issues. And it's a real pleasure for me today to introduce John, whose talk is World of 7 Billion, Population, the Environment, and Social Equity. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Well, I spoke the other day at, this is part of what now is added up to a 22 college fall tour, which is one more than I did last year. And I was speaking, I'm going to be all over the country. I'll be up at MIT in a couple of weeks, and Madison, Wisconsin, Boulder, Colorado. Last Friday I was at Cal State Northridge, so I'm all over. And a couple of weeks ago I was speaking at a little university about an hour west of Charlotte called Lenoir-Rhyne. And I'm going to hand these out today. I handed out, it's just an anonymous survey sheet that hopefully you can fill out by the end of the presentation. And let me know how I'm doing. And there's a space for comments, and one student put in, "You should bring food next time." So I'm glad somebody did, because most of what I learned about politics I learned during a 20-year period of my life, now receding into the past, when I worked in about 50 political campaigns. And the secret to grassroots organizing is, and I hope will always remain, pizza. You know, that tells you learn more about organizing sometimes from ordering pizza than you do from anything else. But that was in another day and another time. I'm now head of a group called Population Connection. We were founded back in the late 60s under the name Zero Population Growth. We changed our name about a decade ago. I could spend an hour talking about why, but the short version is because the old name tended to scare the children a little bit. You know, it sounded a little harsh. And it sounded a little like we were here to tell you what to do, which we're not, and you wouldn't listen if we did. So we're really looking at things more broadly. And what we try to do is make connections. Make connections between issues that, as disparate as poverty, women's rights, the economy, the environment. And of course, when you start making these connections, and I could put 1,000 circles up there, the lines would go every which way. The connections are as complex as humans and as the environment itself. And we try to explore those connections to population. We do that in several ways. One, as Tom mentioned, and I won't dwell on it, we do have the only, best and only, which is the secret to being the best at anything, the only nationwide population education program, K through 12, reach about 3 million students a year around the United States and a little bit elsewhere. We do not try to tell students what to think. We try to get them to think about these issues. We do have a second path to our work, and that does involve 535 women and men who we do our best to, if not tell them what to think, try to tell them what to do, and that's the men and women who serve in Congress, and of course the folks who are president and those who serve him in the administration. And our focus as an organization is this. We believe that population growth is one of the preeminent global challenges of our time. And we believe that the way to meet that challenge is through universal access to affordable voluntary contraception coupled with the full empowerment of women. That's it. That's the whole speech. Thank you very much. No, I have some slides to show to go on. But we have about 150,000 members and supporters around the country, and we lobby and advocate and educate on these topics to try to move things forward as best we can. I'll welcome everybody to Durham. That's the population, by the way. It does include the nearby continents. There's a saying in the environmental field, there's no a way to throw anything. And the best way I can exemplify that is perhaps in this fashion. Midway Island is called Midway Island for a reason. It is midway across the Pacific. It is just about as far as you can get from anywhere in this world, being halfway between Los Angeles, where I was the other day, and Tokyo, Australia. Well, Midway Island is a nesting ground for the albatross. Fat, ocean-going birds that have 6-foot wingspan, and thousands of them nest there. And that's where they have their fledglings. And they go out across the ocean, across the Pacific, looking for food. And they venture into a vast area known charmingly as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, where all that crap that we've put in the ocean ends up. And they'll spy something that looks like food, bring it back and feed it to their babies. And this is the result. 25%, and this is an unretouched photograph of a fledgling albatross on Midway Island. Nothing was moved or touched. You can see it is filled with plastic crap. And all of it was found by the birds as they ventured over the ocean trying to find something to feed their babies. And so this is the away where we can't throw things anymore. We're all kind of in this together on this planet. And I don't mean that the way somebody does on a Hallmark card. Sometimes it would be nice not to all be in it together, but here we are, and we've got to figure out a way to kind of get through it. Now, as I talk about population, this statement, and I'm not going to read it, you can read it, I think encapsulates the issue as well as any I can come up with. As it says, it isn't just knowing about it, you've got to figure out a way to get people to respond to it. Now, the person who said this, the man who said this, was somebody who knew a little bit about social change. And I think of the movement to try to empower women and to make sure that contraception is freely available is a social movement. And the man who said that was somebody who knew a little something about social movements. These were the words of Dr. Martin Luther King in 1966. He was right then and now. And when he said those words in 1966, world population was growing by about 82 million a year. Today it is growing by 82 million a year. So we can't simply say, well, he was right then, but that was then, and this is now. It remains an issue of global concern, and I think we are in the middle of about 100 to, and I hope I'm wrong about the latter, 150-year process of meeting this global challenge. At best, we're perhaps halfway there, as I'll explain. But like all great social movements, the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, these things take generations. The gay rights movement seems actually and happily to be moving once it kind of got, where movements start is always hard to pinpoint, but you might say that started with the Stonewall riots in New York City, as they were called. But all of these movements take time. I mean, the women's movement in this country arguably started in 1848 in Seneca Falls. Look how long it took, 80 years to get the right to vote. Look how long it took until we had a woman elected to serve in national office, namely as the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. These things do take time. Now, I want to talk today about the impact of population in 3 areas. I want to talk about people, plants and animals, climate, and then I want to talk about how we can meet the global challenge. Now, I want to talk about something that happened in the United States. When I was a kid, when I was 10 years old, I was raised in Washington, D.C., spent most of my childhood there. And I remember a snowy, cold morning in 1961. And it was the day that it was a crisp morning, there'd been a heavy snowfall the day before. It was the day John F. Kennedy was inaugurated president. At that time, American women had 3.4 children each. I was also in Washington 16 years later, when I was 26, watching Jimmy Carter be inaugurated president. By then, the average woman in the United States had 1.7 children. That's a 50% drop in just 16 years. That's a remarkable change in a society. It did not happen because of some czar or bureaucrat or commissar giving orders, nor was it the result of some crisis or calamity. It was the aggregate of tens of millions of individual decisions that caused our family size to be cut in half in just 16 years. And I'm going to talk about it now for a moment so that we can maybe think about how it applies, or doesn't, as you see it, to other places around the world. Well, one great way to look at culture is through advertising, because let's face it, every advertiser is trying to do the same thing. They're trying to put an ad out there where you see someone like yourself that you can identify with in the ad, and you kind of see yourself, maybe I'd like to have that iPad or drive that Jetta or whatever the product is. So this is a print ad, and I could show you a bunch of them, but I'm only going to show you one, which was from the late 50s, and particularly the young women in the audience. Think about this ad and ask yourself if you kind of see yourself in this ad. Christmas morning, she'll be happier with a Hoover. Doesn't she just look, I mean, oh boy, nothing says Christmas more than a Hoover, does it? Not that I'm anti-vacuum cleaner, but you know what the implication is, what she's going to be doing 5 hours later during the bowl games. He'll be watching the games, and she's going to be hoovering up the chips. This is not an Onion ad. This is not a spoof ad. This is an actual ad. And it shows you how much we've changed for the better, in my view. Others think not. But how much we've changed for the better in this country in terms of the way women perceive themselves and are perceived in society. Now, that happens for lots of reasons. One of the reasons is education. There's been a tremendous change in the last 50 years. Certainly, women went to college before 1960. My grandmother graduated from Bryn Mawr in 1896 with a degree in math. But that's not the rule in those days. If you look at this, it's kind of good news for the women, not such good news for the men. It's literally a 60-40 shift over the last 35 years in terms of graduation rates. So there's been this tremendous upsurge. And when women have education, what do? They're much better prepared to go out and start a career, and they do two things generally. One, they defer having children until they're established. The correlation in the United States between the age at which a woman has children and how much education she has is perfect. Perfect correlation. The second thing she'll often do, along with her partner, if she has one, is decide maybe not to have as large a family, because it can be very difficult to juggle a career. Our development director just came back from maternity leave, just had her second son, Zane, and it's a challenge sometimes to juggle things. We're very family friendly. In fact, she moved from our office in D.C. to San Diego. That's how family friendly we are. She wanted to be out there to be near her family, and I said, that's cool, so that works. But still, these are challenges. So that changes things. Technology. This was the first birth control pill in the United States, or the pack. The hormonal levels of these pills were 100 times higher than the pills now on the market, as they've learned how to use them and make them. I would submit to you that the birth control pill and other forms of artificial contraception rank in the top 5 in terms of technological innovations of the 20th century, in terms of the impact globally. Because for the first time, half the people on Earth are no longer dependent on the other half for the trajectory of their lives. You know, marriages are, I won't say they're a lottery, but not every ticket's a winner. And, it's just the way it goes. And this way, for the first time, women potentially, and actually in many cases, and certainly potentially in all cases, have the ability to control where their lives are going to go. That's the kind of control we need, not population control, which sounds like a bunch of people telling other people what to do. So this technological breakthrough occurred in 1962 when the FDA approved this. Finally, there have been tremendous changes in law. A whole series of Supreme Court decisions in the 60s and 70s, including the Roe v. Wade decision involving abortion. All of these decisions were based upon the following notion, which was first advanced in a law review article in 1890, co-authored by future Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who reasoned, along with his co-author, that essentially, if there is a right to privacy, if, for example, as in the Bill of Rights, you are free from unreasonable search and seizure. The police cannot come into your home without a warrant or exigent circumstances. They can't just wander in and see what's going on. Well, your person is kind of the home you take with you everywhere. And how can you have a situation where people have a zone of privacy in their home but not in their person? And it's that kind of reasoning that led to, believe it or not, in the 1960s, the ruling that laws that were on the books that prevented even married couples from getting artificial contraception were unconstitutional. Now, a year ago I would have said to you, and I did say to audiences, the abortion decision remains controversial, but not birth control. Turns out I was wrong. I did not see this one coming. I missed it. I thought birth control was on that list of things that were sort of like settled. But it turns out it's far less settled than I thought it was in this country, which is a bit of a shock, frankly. But all of these things together, this is how change happened. Changes in women's education, technology, law, culture. And this resulted in a dramatic change in family size. 50% reduction. I want to spend the rest of the time talking about the global perspective, and you can just think about how these things might apply in other places. Here is human population growth through history. It took us till 1800 to get to that first 1 billion. We just added the most recent 1 billion in 12 years. All of human time to get to 1 billion, 1800. We just added the last billion in a dozen years. This the dotted line over is to scale. It's called the J curve of the hockey stick. The reason population took off like a rocket, and by the way, the reason it stops in 2100 isn't because of some prediction of anything. It's simply because that's like asking somebody, how many kids do you think your great-great-grandkids will have? You can't, there's no data, you can't, speculation without data is fantasy, and that's fine, but don't call it, scientific. Now, something happened right in here that caused this dramatic change. And that something were the first elements of public health and modern sanitation. It wasn't that people started having larger families. In colonial times, in North Carolina and elsewhere, the average family size was 7 children, which is now the case in some African nations. It's that children began surviving their childhood starting in the early 1800s because of basic health and sanitation. I was speaking to a room of students in Ohio last year who were studying to be elementary educators. And I said, you're all trained to be public health specialists. Basic public health. Wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. Cover your mouth when you sneeze, that kind of thing. That's basic public health. And it transformed the world. But even happy outcomes, and certainly this is a wonderful and happy outcome, child survival can have consequences. You win the lottery, you're going to discover you have relatives you never knew you had. But the point is that this tremendous population growth was the result of the signal event in human history. But it's had some consequences. And before I get to the rest of the numbers, I want to take a moment to talk about what's behind those numbers. Because this isn't just numbers. These are people, just like us. There's 7 billion of us, all trying to find their way. And so I want to take a moment to talk. I don't leave if I try to talk about all 7 billion, but I'll talk about one. It's this pretty little girl here, 11 years old in this picture, Gulem Haider. I'm not going to call her a young woman, because at 11, that's not what she is. She's a little girl, a young girl. She was asked the day this picture was taken what she wanted to be when she grew up. She said, well, I'd like to be a teacher. Not in the cards, because this picture was taken on her wedding day. That would be the bridegroom. That's her husband. Now, I do not speak whichever language, she's Afghani. I don't speak Ashtar or whichever language she speaks. However, that look is universal. That look is the same in every culture. She was asked that day what she thought of this man. She said, I don't know. I never met him before. What am I to think of him? Now, child marriage is now illegal in Afghanistan, but it's still common there and elsewhere. And how this relates to population is that this issue for me is about the trajectory of people's lives. And the trajectory of her life in terms of her dreams and hopes was altered, I suspect, I do not know for sure, but I suspect for all time by her wedding. So she, in all likelihood, is never going to have the ability to make choices. How far do I want to go to school? What can I be? Do I want to get married? Do I want to have children? How many children do I want to have? Those choices are taken out of her hands. And so this is about real people and the challenges they face, and I always try to remember her when I talk about this, so that I don't get too enraptured by the numbers. That said, the numbers matter, and this is population growth. Births minus deaths. The way I explain that number is next time you work out, if you work out to music, pick a song with 156 beats per minute. It would kill me, and it'll probably at least work up a sweat for you. Almost 10,000 an hour. That's human population growth globally. Almost 250,000 a day. Imagine building a city of almost 250,000 every day. 82 million a year. That's human population growth all over the world. But it doesn't happen at an equal rate all over the world. This is... Stop. There we go. This is the distribution. There's really no population growth to speak of in the most developed countries. It's all taking place in the poorest places on Earth, or virtually all, 98%. Africa, parts of the most of Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of Asia, selected parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. That's natural growth, birth minus deaths. If you look at migration, the story is remarkably similar. Most migration globally is poor people moving desperately from one place to another trying to survive. It's not somebody saying, oh, I think I'll go live in Paris for a year. That would be fun, which indeed it would. Indeed it would, but that's not the choice that most people are faced with when they're compelled to seek food or shelter. So this presents a real challenge for us because it isn't really happening here in the way it is other places, and so it's sometimes hard to see it. Here's an example that, and I'm going fast here just because, got a lot to cover and figured, one of our, we have a wonderful program that's funded through a wonderful donor to Duke named Fred Standback. We get 5 Duke interns a year who work for us as paid summer interns. And he supports about 140 different organizations. And as Fred, who I saw this morning, said, well, Duke already screened them for brains, so I don't have to do that. Anyway, you've already been screened for brains, so I figure I can go fast. This is the age structure of the poorest places on Earth versus the most developed, young to old. You can see it's dramatically different. They're a pyramid. We're turning in, we're a pillar. That's a huge difference. Where are we going? This is where we are according to the UN, pretty much 7 billion. We don't know where we're going. It depends on what we do. Now, when the media picks up on this, and they don't mostly, but if they do, they pick this one. They say, oh, we'll have 10 billion people by 2100. Well, that's like somebody entering Duke as a freshman and saying, well, okay, let's say the average student graduates with, I don't know, a 3.2 GPA. And they say, hey, I'm average. I'll get a 3.2. I don't have to do any work. I don't have to show up for class or turn in papers. You have to work for what you want. The difference between each of these 3 lines here in terms of the future is a half a child per woman. Small differences make an enormous difference. This line, which is the one that's least likely of all, shows what would happen if the decline in fertility rates in family size, which has been happening since 1950, were to stall. If family size in every country stayed where it is now, fertility rates, we would have 27 billion people by the year 2100. Which of these paths we'll end up on depends on what we do. And so I can't tell you which one it's going to be, and neither can anyone else. How many people can the Earth support? Joel Cohen, professor at Rockefeller University, spent years researching this question, wrote a book with that title. The answer, he came to find, is there is no answer. The answer is it depends on what kind of life you want and what kind of life you want for everybody else, not just the people here, but the other critters, and of course people yet to come. So you can't come up with a hard and fast number here. You have to ask yourself what kind of world you want to live in, and you want others to live in. Now, if we just look at the number of calories produced globally for human consumption, if we all ate the typical American diet, represented here by this hamburger, there's food for 2 billion of us, the other 5 billion get nothing. If we ate the diet that's typical of the Indian subcontinent, lots of rice, lots of vegetables, a little bit of animal protein, not much, there are enough calories produced globally for human consumption to feed everybody a perfectly reasonable diet. So one might say, well, it's just a distribution problem. Well, distribution problems are not small problems. Remember those miners a couple of years ago who were trapped underground in Chile? You could have said to them, don't worry, there's lots of oxygen up here, it's just a distribution problem. Well, distribution problems are a big deal. Now, the challenge in the world is that more and more places are trying to be like us. Until a student put me right, who spoke Chinese, I I always said that says Americans are trying to kill us. It doesn't actually. I think it just says McDonald's. But the point is that's the way the world's going. And as the world moves in that direction, it takes vastly more resources to produce a pound of meat than it does a pound of vegetable protein. So the challenges only get greater. There's another road we could go down. There's another choice here. We could all elect to live the way people do in the poorest places in Africa. If we did, based on current utilization rates of resources, there's room for 40 million of us. No worries, although I think this guy looks a little worried, but, or past worrying. But, that's a choice. I don't particularly like it for me, and I don't like it for them. But it's just a question of how we want to live and how we want others to live. Now, when you look at Africa, one of the great challenges in Africa and elsewhere is water. I mean, you can only live 3 or 4 days without water. That's it. You're done. Well, if you look at Lake Victoria, which is bounded by 3 African nations, you'll see here in a moment a timeline, and then you could see low to high population density. That represents a quadrupling of population density around the lake, starting in 1960 in parts of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. You notice the one thing that's not growing here is the lake. The lake is actually shrinking a little bit, but the population is growing dramatically. Now, you could say, there's plenty of water. Look at the Great Lakes. Well, okay, but getting water from Lake Michigan to Kenya is a daunting challenge. In fact, there's this thing called the Atlantic Ocean that's in the way, not to mention a number of intervening countries. So water is a real limiter in any given place. About 800 million people on any given day experience some form of water scarcity. Getting up in the morning and not really knowing if you're going to be able to find a safe source of drinking water that day. 22,000 children a day die under the age of 5. I have nothing to compare that to. It's just a number that has to stand in its own horrible self. Half of them, 11,000, die from easily preventable causes, and one of the leading causes is dirty water. You drink dirty water, you get diarrhea, your electrolytes get thrown off, you die. That's how it works. We don't need, technological breakthroughs are wonderful, but we don't need them to solve some of these problems. They're of a different order. If this room were the world, everybody from here over would not have access to indoor plumbing. 40% of the world lacks access to indoor plumbing, which was a big technological breakthrough around 1800. If in India, far more people have cell phones today than have access to indoor plumbing. Because the technologies, the kind of infrastructure you need for those two technologies are so different. And modern sanitation is a much tougher thing, even though we know how to do it. Knowing how to do something and doing it are two different things. So that's the impact on humans. And bear in mind, all of this is happening in a world where 1 out of 7 of us lives on less than $1 a day. So it isn't just a question, put it in their hands and they'll buy it. Well, the market doesn't work when you have no money. I mean, it's just, when there's no money, there's no market. It's how it works. We also impact plants and animals. An example of a one-time habitat, the Aral Sea in Asia, half the size of North Carolina, 4th largest lake in the world. Look at what happened in less than 20 years. This is satellite photography of the lake. Look what happened to this lake that was half the size of North Carolina in less than 20 years as water was diverted for agriculture and other human uses. It went away. Now there was even the worst calamity may have some benefit for someone. The camels are happy. These ships, that used to be part of the lake. Now they just sit there and the trawlers are now used as shade by the camels. But that's not really the intended purpose, if you will. This is what can happen almost overnight in terms of human impact. If you look at the cod fishery off Newfoundland, for hundreds of years, people went to the sea in tiny, tiny trawlers, some smaller than those, ventured out from the Atlantic coast, from places like Gloucester, where I used to live. And this is a picture of sustainability in here from 1850. Ups and downs, but it was sustainable. Then along came European trawlers that vacuumed the fish out of the ocean, basically. Look what happened. Look at the yields, sky-high yields. A collapse within less than 20 years. Now, you could say, well, there's been a recovery. They caught one. But what happened to those European trawlers when the fisheries collapsed? Did they sell them for scrap? No. Some of them are now in the Indian Ocean, off the coast of Somalia, where they're fishing, often illegally. And the Somali people who fished for years and survived on it can't compete. Only 2 to 3% of their land is arable. And for 20 years they didn't even have a navy. They have a small one now. So, what do you do if you're a Somali fisherman and you can't compete and your family is hungry? I am not here as part of the pro-piracy coalition. But that's what happens. A UN official said, and it was right, when people run out of food, they can only do one of 3 things. Starve, and if it were me, I'd say, could I hear my other 2 choices, please? I don't like this one already. 2 is migrate, move, but often there's nowhere to move to. Or engage in some form of extra-legal action, whether it's revolt or something else. Now, an owner of one of the hijacked ships off the Somali coast said a couple of years ago, he said, I have something in common with the pirates. I don't want them to have my ship, and they don't want it either. We're just negotiating how to sort this out right now. So again, this is not a healthy or helpful outcome. But this is what happens when the demand for fish is such that prices are driven up and people will do whatever they can and use whatever technology they need to extract the profits without consideration for the impact on the resource. Endangered species, there are tens of, we don't know how many, there are at least tens of thousands that we've counted so far that are threatened or endangered. I just threw a couple up, and these are the number left in the wild. Just for illustration, there's 500 monk seals left in the wild, 300 snub-nosed monkeys. In the case of virtually every one of those thousands of threatened and endangered species, it's human actions that have brought this about. Hunting, habitat destruction, climate change, all of those things. You know, there are 120 of these Iberian lynx left. There are 113 of these wombats. There really is somebody for everybody out there, which is comforting, I guess. 50 Australian parrots, these parrots particularly. 29 of this particular subspecies of marmot, Vancouver Island. I would think, it just seems to me we could carve out a little spot for 50 or 60 of them, but we're not really good at sharing, really. That's not one of our strengths as a species. Now, the Yangtze River dolphin, the baiji, pictured here, seem to be extinct. They lived for 20 million years, their species did. 3,000 to 5,000 lived in the Yangtze River Delta 100 years ago. There may be some left. They can't find any. Even if there are, they don't think they're enough to sustain the species. What killed them off? Sewage, industrial pollution, agricultural runoff. As the population grew rapidly in China over the last century, and urbanization and industrialization took its toll. So they seem to be gone. Now, Pixar or the other brilliant people could probably make a really moving picture about the baiji. I don't know if even they could do it with the boreal felt lichen, this fuzzy stuff that grows on the side of trees in the maritime provinces of Canada. But it too is a threatened species. It exists because it fits. It has a role in that ecosystem. And once it's gone, things will change. And we may not even notice that change right away. But it will have an impact. It will have an impact. And we're the ones who are basically doing this across the board to thousands of species. We're the first species in the history of the world to have anywhere near this kind of impact. Climate change. Now, you know, when you talk about climate change, you know, not every arrow points in exactly the same direction ever in life. But at some point, you know, the data starts to accumulate. You know, there are signs. It's like that, I don't know why I keep thinking of it. It's like, you ever see that shirt that says, bomb disposal team, if you see me running, try to keep up? You know, there's some information that's useful. So what's happening with climate change? And, you know, we could spend an hour or a year talking about it, but look at the last 20 centuries. The blue line is human population growth, you saw it earlier. The red line is fossil fuel emissions. It's pretty straightforward. It's, you know, it's not hard to figure out how this is happening and who's doing it. Every 60 seconds we pump, well, you can see, read for yourself, 19,000 tons carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's a significant change. 19,000 tons is that's a lot of anything. So what's happening? Look at Portage Glacier in Alaska. Look at what I would term late Portage, less than 100 years later. That's a dramatic change. That's a dramatic change. The tiny island nation of Kiribati, pronounced differently from its spelling, in the South Pacific. Highest point of elevation, 12 feet. Most of it, 6 feet. What are they going to do? Or even more specifically, who do they sue? You know, if you own a piece of land and somebody decides to flood you out from upstream in this country, you can usually do something about it. You go to court. What court do they go to? And if they do, the only relief they're going to get, if they say, hey, all you developed countries, stop emitting carbon, they might, well, we'll give you some relocation assistance. But that may not be what the 125,000 people who live there want. They may want to say, no, we kind of like our home. We don't want to be dispersed from the place we call home. But if the waters rise, things are going to change for them and for millions of others, and not for the better. And again, you know, all of this ties back to climate change. You hear a lot of talk about technological solutions, and they're great. It's great talk. It's called not the silver bullet, but the silver buckshot, all the different approaches to climate change. Brian O'Neill at the National Center for Atmospheric Research has found that if we move to that low line on the UN projection, the most, in my view, the best possible outcome in terms of human population growth through voluntary programs, it would be the biggest single slice of the carbon pie. It would do more than 1,000 mile per gallon cars. It would do more than that. Tim Dyson at the London School of Economics found that if we reduced our carbon footprint by 1% a year in the developed world over the next 40 years, 100% of that is wiped out by population growth, 100% of it. And bear in mind that in many places on Earth, people today are experiencing carbon starvation. The latest numbers I've seen, I just looked at them again for Chad, in terms of fossil fuel emissions are 0, because they're measured in 100-pound increments. There's round to 0 because they're so low that they just round down. Our emissions are more than 100 times there. And I don't want to overlook the fact that most of the population growth is taking place in places where, in most cases, the CO2 emissions and related climate atmospherics emissions are low. And there are exceptions to that in terms of methane and other things. Whereas most of the fossil fuel emissions are taking place in places where family size is low. So you have this disconnect here. And the answer is not that we should work on one consumption to the exclusion of population or population to the exclusion of consumption, but just to realize they're both part of the same equation and they both deserve attention. And yet I think you hear a lot more when the climate change comes up about fuel-efficient cars than you do about the population piece of it. So what do we say to women in Africa? What do we say to women who have 7 children each? Well, first thing, the last thing they need is a lecture. That they don't need. Believe it or not, it was a former Republican member of Congress whom I've known for a long time. I think he quit a few years ago because he couldn't take it anymore down there, up there now. He said, to his great credit, he was a very strong supporter of family planning. He said to his colleagues on the floor of the House, words to the following effect. He said, that woman, that mother in Africa is just like any other mother on earth. She'd walk barefoot across broken glass to save her child without giving it a moment's thought. That's what mothers do. They wouldn't give it a moment's thought. So she cares just as much about her children as anyone else, but most of the time she has to watch some of them die. She doesn't have choices. Often she doesn't even know what a choice would be. She can't even evaluate it because she may have never been more than 2 or 3 kilometers from her village, may not even have a primary school education, may be in a situation where she has no control of her own fertility. So today, there are 215 million women on Earth who would like to limit their family size, but there are impediments in their way. Not just impediments of cost and availability. There can be impediments of misinformation, partner interference, all kinds of things. It's not as simple, it's not just a question of dropping contraceptives on Africa and hoping for the best. It's a much more complex process than that. So how do we get at this? What can we do? Well, I want to wrap things up. One more part to this, but I want to begin to wrap things up by giving you an example of a couple of great success stories that have gotten a bit out of order here. Bear with me a moment. Well, I did it right, but I did it wrong. I want to talk about Iran. Iran, 1985, Muslim nation, 6.5 children per woman. The clerics, the theocrats, the men, decided they had a problem. To their credit, and I'm not here as part of the Iran support team, they decided to go down the road of voluntary approaches. Here's what they did. They decided to provide a condom factory and make contraceptives freely available without regard to, if you needed them, they were there. 2, women's education, dramatically ramped that up. 3, television and radio ads to promote family planning. 4, believe it or not, you can't get married in Iran without showing up with a certificate saying you took a course in family planning. Kind of like driver's ed. Makes sense. 5, the clerics, the religious leaders there put out a series of pronouncements saying that tranquility is an Islamic virtue and that small families are more tranquil. One need not subscribe to the Quran or any other holy book to be able to determine empirically that among the great gifts of children is not the gift of tranquility. So, what happened? Well, I'll tell you what happened to those 6.5 children in Iran in 1985. But first, I want to talk about Mexico for a second. In Mexico, they had 6.8 children in Mexico, our neighbor to the south, in 1970. This is a country, very Catholic country, with a strong and proud reputation and history of separation of church and state. They did 3 things. Literacy programs for men and women alike. Family planning clinics that our tax dollars helped pay for, but do not anymore. Not because of political reasons, because our neighbor, in effect, was able to come to us and say, thanks, neighbor, for helping us when we needed help, but we've got it covered now. We don't need your help anymore, but we sure appreciated your being there when we needed you. Words to that effect. The third thing they did and do in Mexico is they have comprehensive sex ed that leaves nothing to the imagination, which is the only way to do it. This is a poster put out by the Mexican government. Older brother talking to the younger brother, pack of condoms. You can see what he's saying. Imagine if Obama sent that poster to every 5th grader in America. You know, there would be, the emergency rooms in America would be filled with stroke victims by nightfall, I guarantee. So what happened in these 2 countries? Well, this is a timeline down here. This is a number of children per woman. Let's look at this. Mexico went, it's the yellow dots, went from 6.8. Today it's 2.3 children per woman, replacement rate being about 2.1. Had Mexico not done this, if they had stayed at 6.8, there would have been an additional 50 million unplanned births in Mexico. That would not have made things easier for Mexico. And they're in the middle of a drug-induced civil war right now, thanks to our insatiable demand for drugs. Iran, 16 years. Same amount of time it took in the U.S., interestingly. 16 years, they went from 6.5 children to 2 with no coercion. Now, presently, Ahmadinejad and I'm using his title, supreme leader, the Ayatollah, are trying to reverse this whole policy. I don't think it will succeed because there's no recorded instance in any country once women and couples have freely and openly decided to have smaller families that they have reversed that. We'll see. But there's an effort there on the part of the religious fundamentalists in that particular country, they're not the only country that has such people, to reverse this practice. So, what do we do? What's our role? What's the United States' role? Well, we put $2 per American per year into international family planning. $2 per American per year. This program was started 40 years ago by a Republican named Richard Nixon. Here's what that money buys. Here's what results from your $2, if you will. By the way, look at that third number. In the history of the world, this is a medical fact for those of you who are thinking about going into medicine. In the history of the world, no woman ever had an abortion who wasn't pregnant. That's just a fact. If we can agree on nothing else, could we agree on that? 6 million fewer unplanned births. Now, I could stop there, but you know those late night ads? But wait, there's more. You know, wait, there's more. 430,000 infant deaths averted. Because when women can plan and space their children are more likely to survive. And who else might survive? The mothers. This saves 25,000 mothers' lives a year. And incidentally, this is an issue that you may have seen some coverage. Melinda Gates has decided to champion this as the cause of her lifetime. And we don't get any money from them. If they want to send us a check, that would be nice, but I don't get any money from the Gates Foundation. I think it's great. And she's talking about how this saves mothers' lives. I bet you if you went around and you tried to get people you know to say, I'm raising money for something. I want $2 from you. Well, what will it do? Well, we can save almost 500,000 children and 25,000 mothers. Most people would cough up. They might not give you $200, but most people would cough up $2. I mean, that's what we do. I'm proud as an American that we do this. We are still the biggest player in international family planning around the world. What we do matters. Now, very briefly, and I won't go into this in detail, the challenge is these magenta lines are the current use of contraception in these countries. That's the unmet need. So there's a great demand out there that still remains unaddressed. Why is this the case? Why is international family planning underfunded? Well, I'm going to leave this slide up as I wrap it up because I want to talk just briefly about some of these, and maybe there'll be a question or two. One, we are in a global recession. There are tremendous fiscal pressures. So we're heading in the lame duck session for this fiscal cliff in our own government, and certainly governments around the world are feeling the strain. Two, as I pointed out earlier, the birth rates of places like Europe, Japan, and to a lesser extent the United States are so low now that it's hard for people to see that this is a problem because it isn't a problem for them. Three, the HIV/AIDS pandemic diverted, in effect, a lot of potential resources away from family planning. And I'm not questioning that funding. There are only 2 or 3 good things I can say about George Bush. But one of them is that he did an admirable job, by and large, not without its problems, but in the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief. That is, if there's a bright light to a fairly dismal period in our history, that would probably be it. But the fact is that this has caused a drain on resources for family planning. 4, this conflict we have, aren't we really the problem? Don't we really need to reduce our consumption levels, our carbon footprint? Yes, we do. But that doesn't mean the other half doesn't matter. The other half of the equation doesn't matter, the population piece of it. Assumptions about racial bias. Sometimes I hear, and this is mostly from, actually most of the critiques we get are from the right. I also get it from the left. And the critique from the left is often, what right do we have to go into Africa and tell people how many children they can have? The simple answer, no right whatsoever. That's not our job, and it's not our business. And our history of going into Africa and telling people what to do is not a happy one. That said, we have an opportunity to make options available upon request. We don't go into any country. Our aid is not in any country unless that country asks us to come in. And incidentally, as a matter of law, the only contraceptive methods that we provide around the world through our funding are methods that any American woman armed with a prescription can go into her pharmacy and get. So we're not playing dice with other people's health. There was a great conference in Cairo in 1994, and I won't go into all of it, but it dramatically expanded the agenda beyond family planning to a much broader agenda of women's rights, including education and economic empowerment, which was wonderful. But there was, unfortunately, a sense that if we build it, they will come. That if we broaden the agenda, funding will just flow in for all these things. Well, they broadened the agenda, good. The funding did not flow in. So you have a broader agenda still with limited funding. And so the money has to be stretched farther and farther, and it doesn't go around. And family planning has often kind of come up on the short end of the stick. And an unrealistic theory, it's this the demographic transition in brief, and there are thick books on it, are you get rich, you have smaller families. That's the short version. Problem is, it doesn't work if you don't get rich. And if you're in an African nation where the population is growing at 2%, the economy is growing at 1%, if that, you're getting poor. So you need a way to deal with this. You can't just sort of wait for the world to fix itself, because the evidence is spotty in that regard. And finally, and this is a problem in, funny problem, little parentheses today, but the attitude of what I would call fundamentalists, and you can come up with your own term. I don't view them in this country as conservatives. I've known plenty of conservatives in my life and liked them, but I don't think that the people who are opposed to birth control in this country and who are opposed to other things along those lines really represent the traditional mode of conservatism. Anybody who's studied American political history knows about the Republican candidate for president in 1964, Barry Goldwater of Arizona. If Barry Goldwater wasn't a conservative, there are no conservatives. He supported Planned Parenthood. The father and grandfather, the two Bush presidents, Prescott Bush, was the first treasurer of Margaret Sanger's Planned Parenthood, national fundraising. So we have here in the United States and elsewhere this rise of a whole new or very old breed of political force that is on the opposite side from me. And I'm sure there are spokespeople for that who could do an eloquent job of laying out their point of view. But it is political pressure. It is political pressure, and we all have a right to exert it with it, in this society. But it's political pressure from, frankly, the right that has caused funding to be slashed during the Bush administration, that caused the imposition of a variety of restrictions, including something called the global gag rule during the Reagan-Bush administrations, which were repealed during the Clinton and Obama administrations. So this issue is very much a political football. And the outcome of all of this is not going to be decided. It might be decided in my lifetime. But as my wife says, since the best hope we have is for this to get done in the next 40 to 50 years, by then I'll either be in the home or on the hill. I'll be wondering if it's pudding day if I'm lucky. It's going to be decided by people who are undergraduates at Duke today. And I don't mean people in general. I mean specifically people who are undergraduates at Duke and others. But you're the ones who are going to be able to move this forward and complete what I see as one of the great social movements of our time. Complete is too strong a word. The civil rights movement is not complete. The women's rights movement is not complete. The gay rights movement is certainly far from complete. But when you look at where we were and where we are, there's been great progress by any regard. We're halfway through this great social movement that Dr. King talked about. And I think that if we do it, it's going to make a world of difference. Finally, human population growth is the only global challenge I know where the following three things are true. One, we know how to fix it. We know where babies come from. There's been research done. There's books on it. Number one. Number two, it's relatively inexpensive. I talked about $615 million a year. Nobody else in terms of federal programs that you're going to run into talks about millions anymore. Everybody else is in the billions and trillions. Modest investment yields tremendous returns. And finally, women and couples everywhere want to be able to control the trajectory of their lives. When women's lives improve and when they have more money, as just to cite one example, and more education, more money, they choose smaller families. When men have more money, and this is just an observation, I don't have any data to back it up, they choose bigger televisions. And Freud might have something to say about that, but I'm going to lay off that one. The point being that we can fix this. We can fix this within your working lifetime. And we can meet this challenge. And with all the challenges we have on this planet, wouldn't it be nice to put a check mark next to one of them and say, we took care of this one, let's move on to some of the others. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I appreciate it so much.